Yes.
Bruce, before I turn to the next topic, there's one further Rosemary Biggs document that you referred to or drawn the inquiry's attention to that I just wanted to ask you a little about. Shomek, it's HSCO 601, please. And we can see it's the treatment of haemophilia A and B and von Willebrand's disease, a book edited by Rosemary Biggs. If we go on to the second page, we'll see the date. It's 1978. And then if we could go, please, Shomek, to page 7. I'm just going to read, Bruce, one of the sections that you've flagged up and then ask for your observations. So left-hand side, we've got the heading, the susceptibility of patients to infection with hepatitis. And then if we pick it up in the second paragraph down, the dangers of transfusion of infected blood are undoubtedly large. It has been estimated that there may be 30,000 cases of transfusion hepatitis in the USA annually, and that 5 to 10% of these patients die of the disease, Maycock 1972. It is thus of major importance to do everything possible to improve the safety of transfusion blood and of the products that are made from blood. Most recipients of blood have not previously been transfused and are thus not immunised to hepatitis by repeated exposure to virus. In considering the haemophilic population, the issue is less clearly defined, though the hope is for blood products with low incidence of hepatitis virus contamination. The severely affected haemophilic patient is transfused usually many times a year from early childhood, and then there's a suggestion about protection against infection. If we then go to the next page, and pick it up in the first main paragraph, from the number of different donations to which haemophilic patients are exposed in the UK, one can calculate that more than half probably receive virus-infected material at some time in the year. With the use of commercial human factor VIII derived from commercial donors, it may not be long before every haemophilic patient receives some virus-infected material every year. From the virologist's point of view, the situation of the haemophiliac is frightening and unacceptable. The virologist has a natural aversion to the use of a therapeutic material which may contain viral agents, but the virologist does not understand the choice which faces haemophiliacs. For the haemophilic patient, the present choice is not between a treatment of marginal effectiveness and no treatment at all. The treatment given to haemophiliacs is for saving life, for the prevention of crippling. The danger of getting hepatitis is a risk that must at present be taken, and the problems are to assess how great is the current risk and how the risk may best be reduced. And then there's a reference to data collected in Oxford. And then if we look at the bottom of the page, we can see towards the very bottom a discussion of those who receive factor IX concentrate. And then if we go over the page, and we pick it up on the right-hand side under the first bold heading, the need for future observations for the prevention of hepatitis. There are two urgent problems which need solution. One concerns the production of virus-free fractions, and it is to be hoped that progress will be made in testing plasma submitted to fractionation procedures to eliminate virus. The second important line of study concerns the fate of virus and clinical disease in patients. In this latter problem, it is important to know the liver function of patients who receive frequent dosage of factors 8 or 9, and the relationships of liver function to tests for hepatitis B antigen or antibody. It is only by keeping the most meticulous records of individual cases that progress can be made in assessing the long-term danger to patients of repeated infusions of virus-contaminated materials. So far, our attention has centred on clinical illness associated with jaundice, but it will be necessary to assess the significances of various abnormalities in liver function tests and of alterations in the results of tests for hepatitis B antigen on the patient's general health over a long period of time. Now, there's obviously more in this book than that, but those, I think, are the particular passages drawn to my attention. What, if any, significance have you attached to those passages?
Apart from the obvious that they're accepting that you don't have to have clinically frank symptoms to have derangement, there is one thing that isn't said in here that stands out to me more than anything else. We're not talking about a side effect here. We're talking about a virus. We're talking about it in a living being who's being sent back out into the community unknowingly to have sex with a person they love, to interact with their families, play football, maybe cut themselves in the workplace. One of the biggest horrors that I feel as an individual is the thought that I might have hurt somebody I don't even know now, that I might have passed on a virus erroneously to somebody else without meaning to. This is talking about it as if it's a side effect in isolation, if it's restricted to the patient. But that's not true. We've got studies much earlier that show that hepatitis B, for example, is a familial transfer risk. Simple things that, my daughter was drilled not to, but women steal their dad's razors to shave their legs, to shave their armpits. If that razor had been used before, then the chances of transferring hepatitis B or hepatitis C is quite high. We're not talking about saving my life or saving my pain. We're talking about turning me into potentially a vehicle that could cause death to a whole family. If you're going in with frank Hep B and you're shedding virus within a family, I might survive the Hep B, but who's to say my father would? Who's to say my mother would? Who's to say my little sister would? The way this is being talked about is as if we lived in isolation. But we didn't. We lived in the community like everybody else. We went to schools, we went to college, we had lovers, we had trysts from time to time. It's like we all, people had normal lives, they interacted. This is not an isolation. So what we're talking about here is like hepatitis B antigen. You know hepatitis B is a big problem. You've got stuff from the war, and you're sending these guys home. And you're not, the guy's on home treatment. That's a question for the inquiry. Where's the responsibilities under the Employment Act? You've got these people they might not be given a wage, but you're employing them as a volunteer to take over the nurse's job and give their son factor. Does mum know that she needs to take extra precautions to make sure she doesn't get hepatitis? What happens if you're the little kid that trips over and splits your head open? Parents' instinct, you cover the bleed, you put pressure on it. That's how I infected my father. So the idea that we can talk about this as if it's only the patients and we'll sort this out later is bad enough. But it isn't only the patients. We didn't live in isolation. We lived in society. And you were turning us into potential disease vectors and sending us home, sending us back to school, becoming a risk to others. So from a public health point of view, this is one of these points where I am intellectually offended, because from a public health point of view, this is absolutely absurd. Right? You're accepting a serious transmittable disease as a side effect from a treatment, and you're not actually looking at the impact it might have on the broader community. You're not considering the impact it would have on the broader community. And that's the bit that really troubles me from this. It's not so much what's there, it's what's not there. We have followed up X number of families. We have seen no familial transfer of viruses. We've seen no transmission of viruses. There's no data on wives. There's no data on mum and dad. Nothing that's been published anyway. These are not side effects. These are viruses.
And if we go back to the previous page, please, Seamus, I just want to go back to what the text talks about the perspective of the virologist.
Yeah.
So it's the right-hand column inside in that long main paragraph. So we pick it up about 6 lines down, where it says, from the virologist's point of view, the situation of the haemophiliac is frightening and unacceptable. Again, is there any observation or conclusion you have about that passage and what's seen there as the
in part, it's what I've already said, is we're talking about viruses here, so you can't guarantee they're going to stay inside me. It's like I could spread them. So from a public health point of view, it's frightening and unacceptable. From an individual point of view, to accept liver derangement, one of the strangest terms I've heard is the concept of mild liver disease. It's acceptable to maybe have a transient liver disease, it's acceptable to have a chronic liver disease, but mild? In the second most important organ in your body, the one that makes you clotting, biochemically important in brain function, biochemically important just about every part of your body. To regard any inflammation of such an important organ as mild seemed an odd set of terms, a disarming set of terms, deliberately disarming set of terms, I think, in context. But there's no such thing as a mild liver disease. When I worked in nursing, I mean, I came across a guy that was dying from heart failure at the age of 28. He'd caught a cold. He'd just been one of these unlucky people where the virus had migrated to his heart, caused cardio inflammation, and he was dying. You cannot regard viruses in those kind of terms. You have to always treat them as serious. We're talking about pathogens. What we also aren't taking account of here is that we already know certain things about viruses by the time we get to 73 in relation to mutation. One of the other areas where I become intellectually offended is the concept of continually giving somebody hepatitis contaminated stuff and the impact that that might have on not just the expression of disease, but the evolution of virus. Because viruses replicate and mutate at a higher level depending on stress. So if I catch Hep B, it adapts to Bruce Norval, that's fine. But if I get another injection that's got Hep B, got Hep C in it, those viruses compete with each other, and you're forcing mutation. They must have known all of this stuff, because this is all germ warfare stuff from before the Second World War. We had the understanding that by stressing viruses, you create greater rates of mutation. And they must have known they were doing that. I mean, my era in haemophilia for factor 9, because of the potential side effect of overclotting, they used to give it us 3 times a day. So 3 times a day, morning, lunch, tea time, you were being infused with a brand new little batch of various viruses, including the hepatic ones. Why wouldn't you expect mutation? Why wouldn't you expect things to go wrong? Everything that you've learned in biology, any MRC paths learned, would suggest everything you're doing is exactly the wrong thing. Counterintuitive. You should be reducing this. I'm totally on the side of the virologist here, by the way. I think it is absolutely unacceptable. Somebody said to me, well, if you're bleeding and you're going to bleed to death, surely this treatment's better than nothing. Yeah, but there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, if you didn't do PE and you didn't have a push bike, would you have had to bleed in the first place? Even if you've declared the side effects, what work are you doing to try and lessen those side effects? Are you trying to limit the exposure to treatment? Or are you actually encouraging behaviour that is going to increase the use of treatment? So at a point where you know it's causing liver derangements, you know it's not good, and you're doing nothing to stop it, you're actually increasing the number of patients exposed. You've got milder and milder patients exposed. You've got younger and younger patients exposed. And as I say, my only conclusion in the end is that they ran out of those of us that they had an excuse to infect, who'd put on the motorway and see what happened, and they had to find new patients. So by the time we get to the late 70s, I mean, I can't believe that they were giving this drug to young boys to play football, to go to PE, to be normal. There's nothing more abnormal than this. And if you were encouraging us to go and play PE, I went to a standard comprehensive school. If you're encouraging us to go and play PE, at what point did you not think that your hepatitis B positive patient might come over in the playground and split their head or skin their knee? So what about the PE teacher that's got to deal with the casualty? What about the kids around you that might got sprayed by your blood? As I say, we did not live in isolation. You're creating vectors. We in effect, as individuals, are vectors for those diseases the moment we've had treatment and walk out that hospital again. We become a risk within public health terms. So I'm totally with the virologist on this. I mean, this is ridiculous. You shouldn't be doing this. And if you are doing it, you should be limiting the treatment at the most to life-saving treatment only, with a clear definition, not a general woolly, as we have here, definition of life-saving. I mean, a clearly defined, this was the only drug that's left. We've seen patients that could have been treated with cryo, but it's more convenient to treat them with concentrates. And certainly the memory I have of going over to concentrates in the mid-70s when the whole thing accelerated was that, well, the first thing was clear, we were a saving because we no longer took up a hospital bed. You didn't get admitted. Right, instead of going up to the hospital and staying there for 3 or 4 days, I would go home, come back, go home, come back, just get a treatment, give some blood. I was no longer this patient that took up a bed. Now, I used to know exactly what the bed cost. I think the average saving would be about £300 a day back then in actual bedtime. But you're using treatment that's going to cause increases in viral expression from the individual. And now you're not even controlling it inside a hospital. You're actually sending them straight back out. I used to get on a corporation bus and go back to school on my own, go and get my treatment, get on the bus, go back to school, even when I was on crutches. Everybody on that bus, I've just been newly infected again. Everybody in my classroom, I've just been newly infected again. So, as I say, I mean, it's just like, at what point does what they were doing to us match with the greater need for public health? So when you're justifying, like, this poor wee hemo, I've got to save his life. Wait a minute, you're spending 10,000 treating a haemophiliac, but in the 1970s we were allowing Muller or two to die from cancer because we're not going to spend 8,000 on our cancer drug. What? How does that work? How are we the most expensive patients? Because it's not going right, and that's not what you're getting from this. Yes, we're clotting, but we've already got hepatitis en masse. As a result of liver inflammation, most of us were bleeding worse, and certainly as I moved into my 20s, the more inflamed my liver got, the worse my bleeding got. And I'm sure it's not an uncommon experience. So you're actually not actually improving anything. All you've given me is an, in quotes, normal childhood, which in my case came to an abrupt end, as it did for so many, at the age of 18, when HIV was associated with my blood disorder. I mean, I regard that as the point where, for a long time, hope came to a grinding halt for many of us. And the only people we could talk to was each other, because nobody wanted to discuss this shit with us. Nobody wanted to, oh no, you're worried about nothing. They would give you reassurances, but there's no science in that.
We can take that down, thank you, Seamus. I'm going to then go back in time now to some of the work you've looked at in relation to the Second World War, which you alluded to in part already. What was it, first of all, that led you or inspired you to look further back in history, back before you were born in 1965, to look at more about the origins of viral hepatitis?
Okay, so you start off by to quantify it, you need to look at the birth of blood products, right? I mean, to me, that's an obvious point. You also need to look at mass exposure, so you've got numbers to actually reproduce adverse or positive results, which of course is the lead up to the war. We had mass vaccination, military personnel. As we were fighting battles, we had the development of the wound packs and the Cohen's fraction. So you have this spell where organic medicines are becoming industrialized. It actually happens between World War I and World War II, but initially I started looking at World War II as just an obvious point where we had mass exposures, to see if the idea that what happened in haemophilia could be a surprise at all. Did it happen before? I think it's a very obvious question, isn't it? You always examine a current accident in relation to the context of practices before, and had this been replicated before. And ironically, it was actually a Radio 4 comedy, a programme called Hut 33, which was based on the idea of Bletchley Park. And they made a crack about, well, I'm not going for that yellow fever vaccine because everybody turns flipping yellow. And I just went, all right, well, I need to know about that. And off you go, and you start typing, and you suddenly hit this Rockefeller vaccine problem of contamination on the albumin. And I came across documents that suggested at one point, I mean, understandably, Churchill wasn't going to make this public, this World War. We had 5.5 battalions disabled through hepatitis, either hepatitis A or hepatitis B, in active frank. And this was like 1941 to 43, when the Germans are sitting at our door. So we had huge amounts of problems all the way through the war. So then the first obvious question from that is, well, surely all these guys that had these vaccinations, you didn't let them donate blood. And then I was reading something about preparations for D-Day. And it dawned on me that to get round the Germans noticing us collecting large amounts of blood, we had gone to most of the military bases and collected the blood from them to create these bottles of powdered blood. So we've taken all these guys that have had the yellow fever vaccine, we're taking blood off them, and then we now decant them 200 at a time into a bottle that's going to be used as a wound pack to treat another group of soldiers who might get wounded on D-Day. So we've just taken all that risk. So you only needed one guy that had the yellow fever vaccine out of 200, but you've probably got 200 in there based on what happened between 41 and 43. And you're now putting them into Cohen's fraction. And then, as I say, I mean, from reports from guys that had actually fought in those battles, so speaking to the older generation, my grandparents' generations I grew up with, my great uncles, they talked about people getting hepatitis in the battlefield. And it was like, you knew from the expression, as we've seen, medicine was able to work out, you know, hepatitis A, very infective, transfers from one person to another, all body fluids are infective. So you tend to notice it would go through a trench, and certainly in World War I, I found examples of what was clearly Hep A going through trenches. When you get to World War II, you've got one guy getting hepatitis, and then the rest of his mates are fine. So you've got one person being sick, and there's discussions about the impact on the fighting ability. You know, if your pal's got sick, are you going to leave him behind on the battlefield? And there were serious discussions about, you know, the implications of having not just wounded soldiers, but sick soldiers being left behind and how that might compromise the behaviour of soldiers. So you're reading all this stuff, and you realise that, well, this is a series of blood products. You've got mass production of albumin. So again, you think, this didn't just happen in World War II then. Need to go back further. And when I got back to the 1930s, there it was. Yellow fever vaccine. Serious problems from the start. Various attempts to heat treat. 33, 37, all inadequate, but they did try and pasteurize it. You've got, I mean, I got back to Jenner's cows. I mean, it didn't even go right then. The smallpox vaccine had TB in it. So we've had these instances. I mean, Jenner's kids died of TB. Their dad gave them TB, cured them of smallpox, gave them TB. We had problems with contamination from the start. They knew they had problems from the contamination from the start. It's part of what military path people were following. And thank God for the American Army and their open publication, because I've been able to follow more of that through American military behaviour than I have through British military behaviour, where most of it still tends on the secret. So we've got this group of people at the end of World War II that we know have been exposed en masse to pathogenic agents that cause hepatic derangement, and we're not excluding them from blood donation. In fact, what we get, and I mean, I'm sure many of my haemophilia friends will remember this, when we used to do Memorial Days, I was in the Boys Brigade, you know, standing on Memorial Day, respect the dead in the war, and then you get all these old guys, chest full of medals. Here's my blood transfusion thing. I've probably got blood. You've probably got some of my blood in you. And you think, well, you were in Burma. It's like, Burma, you're a Burma star. You were in prison in Burma. Aye, I was, son. Were you not sick when you were a prisoner? Oh, aye. But the doctors say it's fine now. I'll give blood. And you just think to yourself, wait a minute, at what point have we actually got any assurance of safety here? All we're doing is taking, this is where the word, my handle on Twitter comes from, Manky Blood, is that there is no other conclusion than the idea that you are, in fact, not only using Manky Blood, you're actually compounding it through military vaccines continuously, as in a document that maybe you'll come to later, Zuckerman clearly demonstrates in an RAF Research 63. The Americans are following it in the 1950s. They've clearly got a problem they know about. But we get to 63, and still no exclusions from military personnel. In fact, what we've got is evidence that they're going into American bases to take blood. Vietnam War, they used some of the most experimental vaccines ever used in mankind. Vietnam War, all those jungle vaccines. But these guys were coming back from Vietnam. They had a spell in Britain before they flew back to America, clear their heads, get rid of their drug addictions. Those guys were given blood. Those guys didn't live in isolation. They're soldiers. They come home to a base. They are out ranting with the local girls. So they're spreading it into the local community. So you're compounding things all the time because you have decided not to tell these guys, because we gave you all these vaccines, you better have sex with a condom on from now on, son. Be careful, you're infective. They're soldiers. They've just got out of base and there's a knocking shop at the bottom of the road and there's a dance hall the other end. What do you think they're going to do? We're into the 70s. We've got the pill. Condoms were almost out the window. And we've done nothing to actually stop these compounded viral vectors, military-made. In fact, because of the very nature of their jobs, because they have seen men benefit from blood transfusion in the field, they've seen their mates' lives saved, they're even more likely to give blood. And then I discovered another oddity about that as well, is that, I mean, it's probably logical in that you've got high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder post-war. So I asked the question, what was the military representation within the prison system? And certainly speaking to the Prison Reform Trust a number of years ago, I got the impression that up to a third of the British prison population, between conscripts and warfare, had actually been in the military in the 60s and 70s. So you've then got that group inside a closed environment who are interacting with each other, who have got unsanitary conditions, who are pissing in buckets, pooing in buckets, hepatitis easily transferred. You've got hepatitis outbreaks in prisons. But we're going to these guys and we're taking blood. So what continually annoyed me was this idea that we've done great harm, but we haven't stopped. We've actually just doubled down again. And the idea that we can't see that by cycling these drugs round and round, we're actually just focusing more and more disease until we get to the early 60s, and then you're sticking it into little genetically defined baby boys. And you're saying it's a surprise we got sick. How come? You're a military pathologist. You must know about barracks diseases. You must know about the new recruits' ill healths. There's plenty of documentation on it. I mean, it took me 10 minutes to Google stuff the other day when my lawyers were asking about it. It's literally in front of your face. It's like the reason why when soldiers go into base to start off with, they're not allowed out for 4 weeks, is because we want them to share the viruses with each other. So they don't get sick in the battlefield. They get sick when you've got medics available, when you can isolate them. So things like respiratory viruses, etc., would cycle around barracks. You lock people in, you basically create a herd immunity, and then you let them out. But that moved into then this vaccine paradigm, and these levels and levels of more and more vaccines. And vaccines offer 2 very specific risks, in that you've got the albumin stabilizer, which thankfully we're now moving away from, and new vaccines are very much examples of what we've learned not to do. But then you've also got the seedlings, the actual source of the virus. Now, most of that was actually made in liquidized monkey kidneys. And the reason that I gave out the cheaper attempt letter was actually because I knew this. And the viruses that we're talking about, Hep B, Hep C, HIV, can't be reproduced in chimps. We've already heard evidence chimps don't even get sick with HIV. So you can't replicate virus through shredding their kidneys, which is what the guy was upset about, because they'd already tried it. Don't use any more of my chimps, you've killed them for nothing. These viruses were only replicated in human beings. We had mass problems in military, and we needed to find a solution. And I'm convinced that's where we come in.
And I just want to look with you at a couple of the documents that you've provided to the inquiry. First of all, on the topic of the yellow fever vaccine, just to see what the origins are of what you've been explaining. You've given us a lot of material about yellow fever, some of which we've referred to in earlier hearings, but there's I think a couple of documents that we haven't probably looked at in a hearing. Could we start, Seamus, with RLIT 301234? And we can see this is the Wilbur A. Sawyer papers. And if we look at the bottom of the page, controlling disease during World War II, 1939 to 1944.
Yeah.
And then if we go over the page, if we look at the bottom half, we can see here, I think perhaps a useful summary of a compressed summary of what you've been in part talking about. So if we pick it up in the second sentence, early in the summer of 1940, the Rockefeller Foundation Board of Directors voted to budget $500,000 for public health work in Europe related to war conditions. And then there's a reference to Sawyer travelling in Europe, meeting with others, returning to the States, and then with US Surgeon General Thomas Parran and Children's Bureau Chief Martha Elliott, he continued to assess and plan for relief and disease control efforts. These included everything from food supplies and nutritional supplements to vaccines for influenza, typhus, and yellow fever. In addition to his Rockefeller Foundation duties, Sawyer served on the Subcommittee on Tropical Diseases of the National Research Council as Director of Commission on Tropical Diseases under the Board for the Investigation of Epidemic Diseases in the Army and as consultant to the Medical Department of the Navy. So can you just tell us who Wilbur Sawyer was, for those who are not familiar with this material?
He's a military virologist, American, kind of spans over the whole development of the Centre Disease Control paradigm in America and also the viral cancer hunter group. So he's kind of the proto guy before all that stuff starts off, attempting to validate and deal with, as I said, the reason for putting people in barracks was to actually allow them to develop herd immunity. People like him were brought in to come up with better solutions. In his case, and the reason the Americans were so big in it was actually to do with something we did to them in 1777 when they attempted to invade Ottawa. The British Army took everybody with smallpox and pushed them at the American lines. So by the time the Americans actually got to the battle, they were already all full of hepatitis and full of smallpox. So the Americans became obsessed with trying to stop disease. And I mean, anybody does anything in military history, you know that Napoleon was stopped by disease, dysentery, yellow fever, hepatitis. It's been an ongoing problem. I mean, the British Army's greatest development until we got to vaccines was actually to dig a trench not contaminating the groundwater. Suddenly we reduced the amount of hepatitis, typhus, etc. that were being passed on. It became important to have working vaccines. And Wilbur Sawyer's job was to actually evaluate the effectiveness of these vaccines, to look at what problems they might bring up, and to try and address them. And I think the most impressive thing that he seems to have done is produce the concept of seed line retention of samples for vaccine production, which is a move that's caused by problems, I believe, in relation to the typhus vaccine, where they had varying qualities of reaction. So the seed lines weren't consistent, they weren't getting the same immune response, so they had to do something about it, and that's where this guy comes in. As I say, it's proto-CDC.
And if we pick it up at the bottom of the page, we can see that he made arrangements for increased vaccine production. This is in relation to yellow fever. Several methods of vaccine manufacture were available by then. The RF standard used human blood serum obtained from a standard pool of blood donors in New York. Because the immunisation campaign in Brazil had encountered problems with jaundice occurring 7 weeks to 8 months after vaccination, a non-serum preparation method had been developed. The serum-free vaccine did not seem to produce jaundice, but it was still far from clear what had caused it earlier. Several experts theorised that another virus had been carried in the serum. Heating the serum to temperatures known to kill viruses seemed to resolve the problem. Because the serum-free vaccine had not been widely field tested and there was no time to do such testing, Sawyer and Bauer decided to stay with the serum-based vaccine. After the US entered the war in late 1941, the Army started vaccinating all troops, not just those headed to tropical areas. By early April 1942, the IHD had furnished 7 million doses to the US Army and Navy, British forces in Africa, and others. In March, however, many cases of hepatitis, mostly mild, were being reported in American troops, especially in California. Sawyer and Bauer went out to investigate, and within a month, the evidence pointed to infection from 9 specific lots of vaccine. These in turn were traced to 2% of the blood donors who had histories of hepatitis but no symptoms at the time they gave the blood. The level of production had required a much larger pool of blood donors for the serum, and no one had checked on their medical histories.
Yeah.
And then if we just go to the next paragraph, at Sawyer's direction, the IHD converted to serum-free vaccine production by June of 1942, but in the end there was still over 49,000 cases of vaccine-related hepatitis that year, 84 of them fatal. So that, when you have told us about the yellow fever vaccine and the infection with hepatitis that resulted, this is what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, Sawyer's working for the Rockefeller Foundation at this point, but the Rockefeller Foundation's kind of working with the American military. One of the things that I noticed very early on, and it's something that came up in the inquiry, and I did point out to my counsel at the time, is that the type of hepatitis C that's across the Western world is very genetically similar, whether you were infected in England, America, Scotland, Australia. It's basically the same disease with just slight phenotype changes, which you would expect over time, especially just since the 1940s. But considering we're talking mainland Europe, there would be an expectation that there would be some relationship between the Hep C in Africa and the Hep C in Europe, because like Hep B, if you look at the Hep B map, you can see a mutation rate progressing from one place to another and marching across the world. But what's really notable, and this was before I discovered the Glasgow work, before I discovered anything else, is that the type of Hep C that's in Australia, New Zealand, that's why one of the other reasons I went to look at World War II, basically all the Allied countries, plus the countries that were on the other side, plus the countries that blew up in between battles, so the whole Asia, Japan, etc. Then you start finding stuff about chronic hepatitis infections in these populations. I mean, Japan, absolute epidemic of Hep B, Hep C, absolute epidemic, but it's not the Hep C, it's the same Hep C that's in England. So the only conclusion I could come up with is there had to be a common source, because you've got very little genetic drift, it's done very little evolution, this is a very hard virus to catch, you have to inject it, it needs blood-to-blood contact. It's not like Hep B where you've got an STD element to it. So you're needing to either transfer body fluids, you're looking at things like ear piercing, body piercing techniques, tribal techniques in relation to various scarifications, whatever. That would logically transfer virus, but at a very slow rate. And therefore you would expect a slow, gentle evolution like you see in Hep B, where there's quite significant genetic differentiation across a long period of time. Hep C, however, you look at it, and there's very little genetic differentiation across the whole of the Western world. Doesn't matter where you are. Which led me to believe, well, there must be a common source. There must be a start point to this, and it must be relatively recent. And hitting the yellow fever stuff, kind of that thought came at the same time. And I mean, while we're sour, I mean, I noticed that we've got... No, we haven't got them there. When you deal with the Rockefeller Foundation, you get into these odd positions as well. I mean, this question that sticks in my head, probably one we'll never get an answer to, is Rockefeller was involved with two PR men. In fact, he's the guy that caused PR to happen. There's another reason to curse him. And he had two individuals working for him, a guy called Ivy Lee, who is the father, and this other guy called Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Edward Bernays goes to work for the Nazis and is in fact the inspiration for Goebbels and this whole thing about a presence on every corner, turning the swastika into a trademark and the ever-present image. All of that stuff's Edward Bernays. But Edward Bernays is working for Rockefeller at the same time as he's selling contaminated vaccines to the Allies. What's going on there? It's like there's assumption. I mean, remembering that this vaccine's coming through pre-sort of 42 originally, before the Yanks have even arrived, and most of them don't get to us until 43. It's only cleaned up in 43. But until then, Rockefeller Foundation seemed quite happy to supply us with a hepatitis contaminated vaccine until the Yanks come in. And I've often wondered if those kind of things at the background were part of the reason why it was so difficult to get to information. You've got very powerful people who might have been doing naughty things, but they're the kind of people where government has sided up to them and said, well, you're going to be our guy now, because we know you did that, and we'll keep quiet about your bit, and you're going to do this for us now. And, I mean, looking at these other vaccines, I mean, we've got... you've got cholera vaccine there as well. I mean, cholera vaccines, Lister tried that several times. Hepatitis B was the outcome. Again, contamination. You've got the issue of zootypes very early on. You've got herpes viruses being passed very early on. I found something, but it was only fragmented, so I didn't actually put it into the inquiry about the early equine vaccines used at the end of World War II and a possible relationship between a forced mutation causing Spanish flu, right? No idea if it was particularly accurate. It was an abstract. I was too busy doing this stuff to get into it any further. Typhus, these were all diseases that we were scared about. This is where you get to the point where it's like, what is the herd? So if you give people these vaccines like typhus, etc., then you're going to make them effective fighting men. But you only need them to exist and be in existence to be effective fighting men. Because you're the army, you don't care what happens when they go home. So there appears to be no thought, well, yeah, we can keep them fit in the field, we can stop them from having dysentery, we can stop them from passing on these communicable diseases in the trenches, but there is no thought to what happens when they go home. Except it's very clear that the American Centre for Disease Control and the American Cancer Viral Hunters seem to have been evaluating post-World War II and then post-Korea in particular, potential contaminations that came from vaccines.
There's a lot of material about the yellow fever vaccine story that you've provided us with, but there's one document I think in particular you wanted to make reference to, Bruce. It's WITN 2235004. And if we go to the second page, so this is a 2006 publication, Immunisation to Protect the US Armed Forces, Heritage, Current Practice and Prospects. And then I'm just going to refer you to a couple of passages and then ask you about this more generally. So if we go to page 10, I'm just going to refer to some passages you quoted in your statement. Sorry, shall we go back a page, please? So we just pick it up, bottom right-hand corner, hepatitis B. So this is the first passage you've quoted, I think, in your statement. In 1942, infectious hepatitis and serum hepatitis were first clearly differentiated. This came about when some lots of yellow fever vaccine were unknowingly manufactured with tainted serum albumin added as a protein stabilizer. And then if we go on to page 14, Shomek, we look at, I'm sorry, I've given you the wrong reference. If we go back a page, my apologies. Under the heading Yellow Fever on the right-hand side, if we go to the third paragraph, you've talked in your statement about the scale of the problem by reference to this. By April 1942, 7 million doses of the vaccine had been given. The programme was complicated by reports of hepatitis in recipients. In March 1942, 100 cases of jaundice and hepatitis were noted at training camps in California. Health authorities quickly realised that the diluent for yellow fever vaccine contained human serum albumin that had not been heat treated. The albumin was contaminated with a previously unrecognised virus that caused hepatitis, i.e. hepatitis B virus. It refers then to the cessation of the production of the serum-containing product. By December 1942, over 50,000 cases of hepatitis B and 84 deaths followed some 2.5 million yellow fever immunisations from certain lots. This accident helps to reveal the differences between hepatitis A, then called infectious hepatitis, and the newly recognised hepatitis B virus, serum hepatitis. Other than those passages which you've referred to in your statement, was there anything more broadly about this publication that you wanted to refer to, please?
I'm just trying to next. Is this immunisation and protection of US Armed Forces?
That's the one.
There's a reference partway through to seed line contamination on vaccines being picked up in a look back. I'm trying to, it's to do with a respiratory vaccine, and I can never pronounce the word right. It means nose, but respiratory viruses were a real problem in military barracks and had caused significant death. And the Americans started using a vaccine. They were also using large amounts of immunoglobulin, which is another scary thing because you've got to ask where they got that from. I mean, you've got gamma globulin being used in the 1960s. Now, gamma globulin, by definition, is an immuno-rich substance. Now, you produce immuno-rich substances by stress from what? Viruses. So, instantly, by looking at gamma globulins, you're already looking at blood that's more likely to have viral presences in it by the nature of the fact that you've got a gamma globulin. The jet injection that was used, the Star Trek thing that everybody thought would be really exciting because it didn't have a needle on it. Nobody cleaned the heads. One person with Hep B in a line in Egypt, World Health Organization, late 1940s, infected a whole village with Hep B because his blood then was just aerosoled into everybody else's. But the one I'm looking for here is the virus SV40, seed line contamination in vaccine.
If you can't lay your hands on it easily, Bruce, I can check over lunch and we can go back to...
and the reason that I'm really interested in SV40 is that SV40 is the grandfather of HIV, and this is 1963. They have done a back check on a seed line batch for viruses. This seed line batch has been used significantly number of times prior to this, probably throughout the 50s, and it's got SV40 in it. Now, that's simian AIDS, and it's been introduced into the army in a vaccination that, from the document there, is clearly being given to all recruits. Now, certain vaccines were restricted. Yellow fever one, they decided to restrict it to only high-risk serving personnel. So unless you were going to do jungle warfare or you were in the Navy, they didn't give you that one. But the respiratory virus one was a problem from the moment you were a recruit, so everybody got that. So that means that en masse, at some point between the 1950s and 1963, large chunks of American military, during conscription as well, were being injected with simian virus 40. At the same point as we're also seeing leukemia, which is HTVL1, appearing en masse in the children of soldiers from previous wars. In particular, notable, there's some stuff around about the Korean War, where again they would have been using yellow fever vaccine in large amounts. So you've got HTVL1, definitely, because you're following T-cell leukemia. And then you've got HIV's granddad, SV40, going into the same groups of people. And I think that's the birth of HIV. We've already got AIDS in a protoform in the 1920s. For those that don't know, it was Cameroonian AIDS was brought back by German colonists who were forced to return to Germany from the colonies as part of World War I settlement. So the Cameroons were emptied, the Germans, they were all sent home. Large amounts of them were experiencing strange lobular pneumonias. Now, we might not have had pneumocystis then. We had a different term for it. And this is one of the things I've learned through the years is when you look back in time, you have to look for new words for it, new descriptions, or old descriptions. And what you have there is a lobular pneumonia described en masse, and you also have deaths, but mainly in children. So again, it looks like you've got a proto-immunodeficiency problem there. Go forward to post-World War II, and you think about American military presences in Germany, for example. One of my oldest friends only died a few years ago as an ex-military American service personnel whose wife was German. It's like, of course they interacted. And of course the Germans during World War II, they were using blood too. They were making vaccines, and they had this proto-AIDS, this HTVL1, in the system. And then those vaccines and those same troops have got this SV40. And I would be really interested in the scientific arguments to tell me that what I've not seen there is that contamination that probably brought AIDS into the human species. I mean, I've never bought the promiscuous gay argument because, quite frankly, the heterosexual community in the late 70s was just as promiscuous. It's an STD. If it was credible as an STD-led epidemic, you would expect to have quite a large number of straight heterosexual people with it as well, because occasionally they're not straight and they have sex with other men and then they come back and pretend they're straight. There wasn't that kind of level of infection. It only seemed to appear in gay people. So the things I'm really interested in relation to that is, well, gay people were targeted for 2 blood products in the 70s. Immunoglobulins, specifically to treat hepatitis B. Where were you getting the blood from that from? We've got stories of haemophiliacs donating blood. Did they get it from us? You've got the Hep B vaccine, Abbott's. All the work that Abbott's did in relation to Hep B testing as well. So, yeah, I mean, at what point aren't we making this? At what point aren't the questions obvious in that we haven't actually discounted our own effect on the birth of these viruses? Gay men were not so promiscuous that every gay man on the planet seemed like, for me, I worked in the music industry at one point, seemed like everybody I knew that was gay was suddenly HIV positive. And we saw those hollow faces and those terrifying looks, and everything got a bit weird and nobody wanted to talk. But it was really restricted to small communities. And so you ask yourself, well, what's different about those communities? What was different about drug addicts? What was different about gay men? The same two things come up: immunoglobulins, gamma globulins, and this very early hepatitis B vaccine trial, 78, 79. And the vaccine trial is really interesting in that one of the main places that the vaccine trial happens is Chicago. And where does AIDS kind of emanate from? We all know the famous stories from Chicago. The biggest clinical trial of the early Hep B vaccine is in Chicago. Now, when I go looking for the Hep B vaccine data, I can't find any. It's almost like they never did a trial. We've just gone from no vaccine to, we've got a vaccine in the mid-80s. Where's the earlier data? Where's the bits that went wrong? And this is a bit that annoys me, because I think we got to a point now where, because of commercial interest in medicine, we're actually not doing good science now, right? Because it's not in the company's commercial interests to release adverse outcomes. It's not in the company's interest to say, well, that drug didn't work. We've dropped it. We've got a new one. Because you might get sued for that bit, and that'll hurt your share prices. And the way American drug companies work now, everybody's blooming retirement plan is based on a drug company portfolio in part. So it's like America is set up so that even the public can't afford for the drug companies to answer for anything they might have done.
Bruce, you've lived and breathed this for decades.
Yeah.
I just want to go back to your observations about the vaccination of the military and the spread of hepatitis. And I just want to strip it to what may seem to you like a very overly simplistic level, but just so that those who haven't lived and breathed for years can understand. Looking at, by way of example, the yellow fever vaccine and what's recorded as being the use of human albumin giving rise to hepatitis in troops, your thesis, in part, is that that vaccination programme, compounded over the years by some of the other vaccination programmes to which the paper we were just looking at alluded to, combined with the fact that those recipients of the vaccines then became part of the general donor pool, indeed became often particularly active and encouraged donors.
Yeah.
That has been a significant cause of the spread of hepatitis, both within the community generally, in the ways in which you've described, so the wider donor pool then becomes infected.
Yeah.
And then the products given to those with bleeding disorders in particular become infected.
Yeah.
And your point, additionally, is that that was all well known to those working in these fields.
Well, it's particularly military pathologists. You must have known about that. I mean, part of military pathology's job was to make sure we had fit, healthy fighting men. So, yeah, the vaccine problems would have been well known to, well, the likes of Rosemary Biggs, who had spent some time in the military, the likes of the general that was the head of the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service. They would all have known about this stuff from their military practice.
And you've referred to one paper already. I think there are two before lunch that I'd just quite like to look at with you, so that we can complete this particular topic. There's the 1964 RAF paper you referred to. So that's RLIT 301239. So this is Epidemiology of Acute Hepatitis in the Royal Air Force. It's a publication from 1964 by Professor Zuckerman of the Central Public Health Laboratory in Colindale. And if we go to, well, if we just pick it up on page 6, I think, which is the last page, Shomik. And we pick it up in the heading Summary. Tells us that 895 patients with acute icteric hepatitis, which occurred in members of the RAF between January 57 and July 62, were investigated. The incidence of acute hepatitis was considerably higher in RAF personnel stationed abroad than in those at home. And then there's reference to the highest attack rate in terms of age. And then the next paragraph refers to the complete injection history in the 6 months preceding the onset of symptoms. And then top of the next page, top of the next column, I'm sorry, show it, talks about then the differences in the incubation periods of infectious and serum hepatitis. And then the next paragraph, the methods of sterilisation and inoculation techniques practiced at most of the 29 units visited were found to be inadequate. And then in the conclusion in the next paragraph is that approximately 100 of those cases were due to syringe transmission. That's just a brief view of the summary. What's your take on, your view of the significance of this particular piece of research in 1964?
Oh, it was published in 63, 64. You already know that you're talking about syringes, right? So here's an example. Not every vaccine came as a single shot. In fact, in military terms, most of them didn't. Now, some of them you would swap out the needle, but you still use the same syringe. So when you do an IM, you draw back the plunger a little bit to make sure you haven't got any blood. Those that have had major bleeds from their COVID vaccine knows that that wasn't done, and it should have been done. You're trying to give it to the muscle. You're not trying to give it to the blood supply. So you draw back a little bit. You will get blood. You'll get tissue. You'll get serum drawn back into the syringe. There's another 10 doses in that syringe, and it's going to be given to another 10 soldiers. You might swap the needle over, but you've already contaminated it with the body fluids that you've drawn in to prove that you haven't hit a vein. So we've got secondary cross-contamination again. So even if you've got 10 guys in a row, guy one is your hep case, he's now put everybody behind him at risk from hep because he was the first one that had his serum drawn into this multi-dose syringe system that the British and American armies were using right up until very recently. We know that hygiene standards, autoclaves, etc., were variable. From working in nursing myself, one of the things that struck me as odd, but doesn't now, is that autoclaves malfunction. They don't get hot enough. So you have to check them on a regular basis. And I remember an incident when I was working in the hospital in Dundee where they checked the autoclaves and they all failed. Every one of them. There wasn't a single one of them was actually doing what it was supposed to be doing. So they had to literally change over overnight into these sealed packs that we could guarantee had been gamma irradiated, and therefore were safe. Autoclaves weren't completely reliable. But here's the thing, these guys aren't living normal lives. A squaddie's not going home when he's been called up, and particularly when we're looking at warfare and early recruiting. They're living in barracks, right? So the occasional razor being nicked off a mate so that you can pass inspection, dealing with cuts in the field, training exercises, training accidents, borrowing a pair of scissors off a bud, getting your fingers stuck in somebody's wound while you're trying to hold an artery closed. I've done that once in my life. You get covered in blood when you're doing that. All of those things would have been replicated on large because of the nature of what they're doing, because of the danger involved in what they're doing. So you could have maybe one infected batch and 200 soldiers. It doesn't matter. By the time you finish basic training, that risk's transferred right around that 200 people, one way or another.
And so going back to your...
So you know that military personnel are totally and utterly unsuitable donors. You should not be taking blood off them. And Zuckerman's pretty much saying that. We can't take blood off of soldiers and military personnel pre-1960, I think was his conclusion. There's pre-1960 in one document where he says it's ill-advised to take blood from people pre-1960. And this was to do with vaccine contamination. You, again, are taking a group of people where you've compounded risk into one place, and then you're sending them back out into the community as vectors. Let's not see them as human beings in this paradigm. Let's just see them as vectors, right? As ways of transferring disease. We're compounding it. Doesn't take much. And then we're sending it back out. And military, as we say, more likely to be blood donors because they've seen the value of blood in the field. My experience at Memorial Days with guys showing me their gold badge that said they'd been donating for 30 years or whatever it meant. We've actually got the people that are most likely to think blood's a good thing as the least best donors. Then you're compounding that further, because in the 50s and the 60s, of course, there's the donor buses. And this was an argument I had, by the way, when we got to HIV about how you couldn't actually exclude HIV because nobody in a factory is actually going to come out and go, oh, by the way, guys, you thought I was really tough. I'm actually gay and I've got a risk of AIDS. You're not going to tell all the buds you worked in a factory you've kept in the closet for bloody years because you know half of them will kick the shit out of you if you come out. So that blood bus coming round to your works where you get bullied to go and give blood, that's not even safe. Because the basic pressures that exist within those environments, not to be disclosed, not to be discovered, right on the factory doorstep. Why don't you want to give blood? You know blood's important, son. Go and give blood. Don't be a wimp. But you could be sitting there knowing, well, full well, I probably shouldn't give blood. It's 1982, there's guys with AIDS. But I don't want to come out to the whole factory. So even that process, right, has problems inside it. The idea that altruistic donation is suddenly a panacea for paid donation is idiotic. It doesn't make sense within behavioural paradigms. It doesn't make sense within public health paradigms. Yeah.
And so, just before we leave the Zuckerman 63-64 work, going back to your huge jigsaw and these small pieces that make up, we've now, as I understand it, in terms of the development of your thinking, we now have the British military, the RAF here,
Yep.
being studied, leading hepatologists, knowledge of risk of particular risks they posed of hepatitis,
Yep.
And the no discouragement or prohibition on the donation of blood, so the wider donor pool again being infected.
Yes, I mean, as I say, I mean, these are guys that will come out of the military. I mean, at this point in time, there could be conscripts or there could be regular guys signed up. But you're creating these socially minded individuals that know the value of blood, and you're sending them back out. Of course, they're going to donate blood, and unless you tell them otherwise, they're not going to not donate blood. In fact, if you tell them otherwise, the first question is going to be the same question that most of us would ask, wouldn't it? Why shouldn't I donate blood? for us to present. So there is also a secrecy issue in that. You need all these Scotties to take these vaccines. If you own up that you might have got a bit wrong before 1960, are the guy recruits in 62 going to take the vaccines? Can you maintain your public health paradigm within barracks, within theatre? Of course you can. And then, of course, you're going to have to pay military pensions to everybody you've given hepatitis to. And you're going to have to pay widows' pensions to... No, let's just keep it secret.
And then you've referred, moving from the military to the general public.
Yeah.
You've referred in your statement to a survey undertaken in the 1970s. If we go to WITN 2235003, oh, I'm so sorry, I've given you the wrong reference, Shomik. It should be 006. And if we go to the fourth page, we can see it's entitled A 3-Year Survey of Viral Hepatitis in West London, the 3 years being 1972 to 1975. It's a report to the Research Division of the Department of Health and Social Security, an analysis of 368 patients tested for serological markers of both hepatitis A and hepatitis B virus infection. And we can see there the authors who include again Professor Zuckerman. What's the particular significance that you attach to this study?
Okay, so to me this is a familiar infection study, right? So what you're actually doing is you're measuring the after effect of the report you made in 63. So if you're sending these military personnel out home to marry, have families, this appears to be, certainly within paradigms, because it doesn't make much sense otherwise, what you're doing is you're actually going out to see if their wife's got Hep B off them, if their children got Hep B off them. And what you're discovering is that you've got hepatitis markers, including some indications in this, although it's not entirely clear, of non-A, non-B markers, not flowing directly from sexual contact, but actually flowing from familiar contact, from that shared razor off a dad, from that toothbrush that you might have just borrowed because yours was knackered. Those things that are actually actively transferring infection into households. So one soldier going home to a family of 4 can mean you've got 4 viral victims within a very short period of time. So you now know that by 74, you're not only 72, 75, you're now not only you're sending these guys home with active viral infections, you're actually sending them home to infect their families. You've got the evidence that's happened. So now we've not just got one unsuitable donor, we've got a household of unsuitable donors. Right, so we've got mum, dad, we've also got the children. So those children might not have been donors until 1980s. By nature of the, how old they were, depends on Zuckerman's observations were. But we've got familiar transfer. So we've got transfers across families. So without even sexual contact, we've got members of families catching Hep B and Hep C, because it appears to be a non-A, non-B marker in there as well, although as I say, it's not entirely clear in the document, from their returning military family members. And this is what this is. It's a follow-up. It's a familiar study. And it just, once you read 63, this clearly flows on from the 63 RAF document.
And then the final point I just want to cover with you before we break for lunch, Bruce, is your understanding from your research of what was known about the potential severity of the harms which could be associated with hepatic viruses. Now, we'll come on after lunch to look at some of the issues relating to cancer and leukemia and so on. But you've flagged up in the material you provided to the inquiry some testimony that Professor Cash gave to the Penrose inquiry.
Yes.
And I wonder if we could just before lunch look at that, and I can ask why you've drawn that to our attention. So Shomik, it's BNOR 40570, please. We can see it's Professor Cash's testimony of the 23rd of April 2011. Shamit, can we go to page 101? And there's a passage that's been highlighted which deals with both developing knowledge of non-A, non-B and knowledge of severity of hepatitis B. So in answer to a question about knowledge of non-A, non-B hepatitis, Professor Cash had been referred to the paper by Prince and others reported in The Lancet in 1974. And then Professor Cash gives this background information. I see Alfred Prince in my 1969 visit to the States. He gave me a small vial of Australia antigen in New York, and I brought it back, and that was the first beginnings of testing for Australia antigen, certainly in Scotland. And if we go to the next page, the question: from that vial you received from Dr. Prince, you were then able to initiate the development of hepatitis B screening. And he says, I was. And most importantly for me in that area is that, and there's been no mention of it in the inquiry so far, that one of the colossally impressive things upon me was the death of my close friend, a surgeon in Edinburgh, in relation to the kidney dialysis transplant viral hepatitis outbreak. And I mention that because it was related to transfusion, a multi-transfusion. The patient had a kidney transplant which was hugely multi-transfused. We carry on. I mention it because the guys, the virologists who we worked with Alfred Prince's stuff, Professor Barry Marmy, and they published all this. They said the reason why this attack, this Edinburgh episode, is so lethal, and it took out 2 surgeons, a nurse and my technician, bless her, and about 4 others. It was a disaster. The reason they said it was so lethal was that they postulated it was a simultaneous double virus infection. A few years later, when they got the hepatitis C testing, they showed that this was a hepatitis B and C, and they had reason to believe, because of problems in dialysis unit of cleanliness, there might have been E in it. So the notion that double infections can be particularly dangerous got into my head. If you ask how can you get a double infection, the only way is large pooled blood products. And then there's a further discussion about the Edinburgh outbreak, the 1969 Edinburgh outbreak. What's the significance you've attached to the knowledge derived from the 1969 outbreak and subsequent events?
I was in the Royal when this was going on, so there's a few things going on here. First of all, we've got unlicensed carrying of viral agents across international borders, which is not a good thing. We have, and I do think that John Cash went on about it a bit more than appears to be in the text, because what he talked about was a centrifuge accident. Now, I had been in the unit because they used to take us down and show us this big fancy unit that they had in the Royal Infirmary. It did look impressive, all these various labs with glass windows where you could watch what was going on. They had centrifuges, and the first thing you do with blood is you spin it out. And the centrifuge shattered and sprayed virally active blood through the unit. That was the story I was given. What we don't understand at the time, and there's a Chicago episode that's well written up in the CDC involving Ebola, where a similar issue took place. We weren't very good at ventilating hospitals, so that those fans that should go straight outside might have connected to the next ward and the next ward. So the idea that you can be absolutely certain that that was a renal unit, although it's quite high that it was a renal unit, isn't there, because what's possible is that the vents literally just showered virus down on the unit. To get to the point where you've got B, C, etc. in another place, then what are you doing with haemophiliacs? Because you've got to know that when you get to 20,000 donors, the incidences of these viruses in the general populace, forgetting those concentrated risk points, just general populace, are so high that you must have so many Hep Bs, so many Hep Cs in each vial. Now, if you're really scared about your staff, my memory of this is patients dying, not staff, although we did see one doctor die in the unit. He just collapsed on us. Why is it okay to protect staff? Why is it okay to be really concerned about protecting staff? But it's also then okay for those same staff, frequently, to be injecting virally rich culture, which is what a blood product really is, a culture, into young boys. where you've got to know there's a large incidence of Hep A, there's a large incidence of Hep B, you've got non-A, non-B paradigm by that point. You had to know that, let alone the herpes viruses and everything else that they realise must be piggybacking on. The other thing about this is it was a very strange occurrence within the inquiry. There was another letter that I've not been able to track down, and it felt confessional, and like, I made this mistake. And Cash appeared to be, and I can remember commenting at the time, and also with the chair of the inquiry when me and him fell out big time. This guy's trying to own up to something here. Can we let him own up to it? Can we let him tell us about the epidemiological event here so that we can get some understanding? But I think the most notable bit in this, and the reason that I brought it to your attention, is that my friend died. My colleague died. Now, we were dying. We were dying through the 60s, all the factor 9s that were giving us concentrates from the early 60s. You had measurements of our liver derangements. You had us in the ward. You saw us get sick. You saw us get respiratory problems. You saw us fight for our lives from babies. But that's okay. But at the moment your pal in the lab dies, that's not okay. So what are we? Are we human beings? Or are we just material? That's what I take from that.
So, I note the time and I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic, so a good point for lunch, I think.
Yes, it is. Well, we'll take a break until 2:10. So 2:10, the same rules apply as did before, and I look forward to seeing everyone at 2:10.